We're in the second book of the Bible survey series that we're doing to supplement Sunday's preaching here at First Assembly of God. If you missed any of the previous videos, they're available in the playlist entitled The Bible, Getting Through It on our Facebook page. The word Exodus means going out or exit. This book is the story of Israel's bondage in Egypt and deliverance by God through Moses. Exodus is filled with messianic types and symbols. The tabernacle is a classic example of biblical typology. The key word in Exodus, redemption, which means to set free. Moses is the author. Jesus said so in Luke chapter 24, John chapter 5. The book of Exodus is actually a continuation of the book of Genesis. In the Hebrew language, the book of Exodus actually begins with the word and, linking Genesis to the book of Exodus, both books being written by Moses. The book presents basic information about the growth of Israel from Jacob's family of 70 people to well over 1 million. Many scholars suggest 2 million people. One of the highlights of the book of Exodus is the giving of the 10 Commandments in chapter 20. In all the Old Testament, it's this book that offers some of the best descriptions of the nature of God's grace and God's power in action. The entire book is filled with a majestic revelation of God as merciful, God as faithful, God as holy, and God as omnipotent. Exodus emphasizes the how, the what, and the why of the true worship that should follow God's redemption. The contents of the book can be outlined in 3 parts: the Exodus, the covenant, and instructions on worship. Chapters 1 through 18 are a narrative of the Exodus. Chapter 1 describes what that enslavement of God's people was like. This new Pharaoh had turned the Jews into slaves because he feared their sheer numbers. They were such a threat to him that he actually ordered that all male babies be killed. This was Satan's attempt to destroy the Hebrew race, and so in doing so, the promised Redeemer would not be born. Chapters 2 through 4 describe the preparation of Israel's deliverer, Moses. The Hebrew people were just in despair, thinking that God was doing nothing for them. If you look back at Genesis chapter 15, you'll see that God prophesied to Abraham that this was going to happen. Just a thought about God's timing. He's not in as big a hurry as you and I generally are, but his timing and his plan is always perfect. In spite of Pharaoh's plan to kill the Hebrew sons, Moses was spared. Actually, he was spared by Pharaoh's daughter, and that's a beautiful story. At age 40, Moses fled to Midian because he had killed an Egyptian, and he stayed gone from Egypt for 40 years. During that time that he was in Midian, God called him to lead the people out of Egypt. When we get to chapters 5 through 13, we have the description of the 10 plagues and the Passover. 7 times Moses told Pharaoh, "Let my people go." God wanted his people free so that they could serve him. Pharaoh refused, and God sent 10 plagues to convince the Pharaoh, let God's people go. Chapter 12 is the story of the Passover. I preached on that last Sunday, and I encourage you to get greater detail about the Passover. Go back and watch the live stream or watch the video rather, from last Sunday's sermon out of the book of Exodus. Chapters 14 through 18 are a description of the Hebrews' early freedom. After the 10th plague, the Hebrews were set free, but even though God had done all that miraculous intervention on their behalf, their faith continues to be weak at best. Chapter 14, they panic at the Red Sea. Chapter 15, they grumble that they can't drink the water. Chapter 16, they grumble that they're hungry. And there's a great story there about quail and manna. God provides daily miracles, and yet they're faithless. They don't obey, and they break the Sabbath. In chapter 17, we're thirsty again. This portion of the book of Exodus is a good reminder why we need to stay relationally close to God. Because if you don't stay relationally close to God, your circumstances will erode your faith in him. In chapter 18, Jethro recommends Moses appoint judges to rule with him. Again, since this is a survey, I can't go into great detail about this chapter, but there are some great lessons here about the hows and the whys of church growth. The work in a larger group must be done differently than a group that is smaller. And different doesn't mean wrong. Chapters 19 through 24 record God's covenant with the Hebrew people. In chapter 19, God reveals his reason for delivering Israel. There's a beautiful passage there. Chapter 20 is a listing of the 10 commandments, the first 4 dealing with man's relationship to God, and the final 6 dealing with man's relationship to other people. Jesus summed up the 10 commandments this way: love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. That's the first and greatest commandment. And the second's like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. Chapters 25 through 40 are instructions on worship. Chapter 25 describes the purpose of the tabernacle. Chapters 26 through 40 are a listing of the specifications of the tabernacle. It was surrounded by a court, 150 feet by 75 feet. It had a single entrance through a 30-foot gate. The altar of burnt offering was inside that gate. This is where the Israelites were to present their sacrifices, and hands were placed on the animal to symbolize the transfer of sin. The death of the animal taught the penalty of sin. This is outlined beautifully in Exodus chapter 27. The bronze basin, or the laver of bronze, was the next piece of furniture. We find that in chapter 30. It represented the need to be cleansed from sin before coming into God's presence. We see a Christian application of that in 1 John chapter 1, verse 9. After the washing in the laver, the priest enters the first room of the tabernacle called the holy place. On the south wall stood the golden lampstand. There's no dimensions given in Scripture, but it is made of gold, about 94 pounds actually. On the north wall of the tabernacle was the table of showbread. We see in Exodus 25 that the bread of the presence is put on this table before the Lord at all times. These 12 loaves of bread representing the 12 tribes, they serve as a symbolic reminder of Israel's dependence on God for their daily need. In chapter 30, we see the altar of incense representing continual intercession. Between the holy place and the most holy place was a veil, or a curtain. Now this isn't some sheer little, this is an enormous, thick piece of separation. Only the priest could pass through it into the most holy place, and he could only do that once a year. Anyone who dared to violate that would be struck dead. All that changed at the very moment of the crucifixion of Jesus, when the curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, signifying open access to God. The most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, contained the Ark of the Covenant, and that contained the 10 Commandments, the jar of manna, and Aaron's staff that budded. It was covered with a lid called the atonement cover, or the mercy seat, and it was sprinkled with the blood of the sacrificial offering to make atonement for sin. This act was symbolic of God's forgiving mercy. The final atonement was actually made in Jesus Christ, as we see in Romans chapter 5, verses 8 through 11. If you have not asked Jesus to save you, can I suggest that when you finish this video, whisper a prayer and ask Jesus to do what he wants to do in you. Sunday I'll be preaching from the book of Leviticus. Many Christians struggle finding inspiration in the book of Leviticus because there are so many rituals that are no longer part of the Christian experience. Trust me when I tell you, you're going to want to hear this. I'd love to see you Sunday, but I'll settle for you seeing me on our live stream at 11 a.m. Be sure to like our Facebook page so you'll get a reminder when we go live on Sunday morning.